The Vatican Bank manages over $10 billion in assets, answers to no government on earth, and is technically sovereign territory inside a city that is itself inside another city. It has also, at various points, laundered money for the Sicilian Mafia, facilitated the disappearance of hundreds of millions in depositor funds, and watched at least one man turn up dead beneath a London bridge before the auditors could ask him any inconvenient questions. The remarkable part is not that a religious institution got its hands dirty. The remarkable part is that the architecture of holiness, sovereign immunity, and diplomatic untouchability was not a bug in the system. So how did the most morally authoritative address in the Western world engineer itself, quietly and deliberately, into a place where the law could never quite reach? A leather briefcase changed hands near the Fountain of the Four Rivers on a Tuesday evening in 1978, the kind of exchange so ordinary looking that no passerby gave it a second glance. A man in a dark suit. Another man in a cassock. The piazza smelled of wet cobblestone and roasting chestnuts from a nearby cart. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody had to. Pull back from that piazza, past the Tiber, through the Leonine walls, and into a set of marble corridors where the air is thick with frankincense, where footsteps echo like confessions, and where the accounting books have historically been blessed with something rarer than divine grace: total, sovereign immunity from outside inspection. Welcome to the Institute for the Works of Religion, founded in 1942 by Pope Pius XII, known to almost everyone on earth by its more modest nickname, the Vatican Bank. The name alone deserves a moment of quiet appreciation. The Institute for the Works of Religion. Religion, singular. Works, presumably good ones. It sounds like it should be funding orphanages in Naples, not facilitating the movement of hundreds of millions of dollars for some of Italy's most committed criminals. And yet, here we are. The genius of the institution, if we can use that word without flinching too badly, was architectural. The Vatican is a sovereign state. Tiny, yes, roughly 44 hectares of marble and moral authority, but sovereign nonetheless. That sovereignty means Italian law enforcement cannot simply walk in with a warrant. It means financial regulators cannot compel disclosure. It means that when money enters those walls, it undergoes a transformation that has nothing to do with prayer and everything to do with paperwork. Dirty money in, clean money out. The incense covers a great deal. Religious reverence does the rest. For decades, investigators who raised uncomfortable questions about the bank found themselves navigating a peculiar social obstacle course. You were not simply auditing a financial institution. You were, in some unspoken but deeply felt way, being rude to God. The Vatican's moral prestige functioned as a kind of firewall, and the men who ran the bank understood this perfectly. They wore it like a second cassock. What was moving through those corridors beneath the frescoed ceilings and the watchful painted eyes of martyred saints? Billions. The precise figures remain disputed because the books were never fully opened, which is itself a kind of answer. What is not disputed? The money was connected to the Sicilian Mafia, to a collapsed financial empire called Banco Ambrosiano, and to a web of relationships that would eventually produce, among other things, at least one body floating under a London bridge. Don't worry about the body count yet. That comes later, along with the mysterious deaths, the missing billions, and the extraordinary spectacle of an investigation that somehow concluded with 0 prison sentences for anyone connected to an institution older than the printing press. For now, just hold the image. A briefcase. A piazza. The smell of chestnuts and whetstone. And somewhere behind those walls, a ledger that God himself apparently had no interest in auditing. The Lateran Treaty of 1929 was, on its surface, a real estate transaction. Benito Mussolini, who was not known for his generosity, handed Pope Pius XI 109 acres of central Rome and 750 million lire in government bonds. In exchange, the Vatican formally recognized the Italian state, and Mussolini got the one thing every authoritarian dreams of, the Church's blessing. Two men who each believed they were getting the better deal shook hands, and a sovereign microstate blinked into existence. It remains, to this day, the smallest country on Earth by area, smaller than most golf courses, and considerably more difficult to audit. That sovereignty was not incidental. It was the entire point. Vatican City operates under its own legal code, issues its own passports, and maintains diplomatic relations with over 180 countries. Italian law enforcement stops at the Leonine Walls as surely as if they were the border of a foreign nation, because they are. Whatever happens inside those 109 acres is, legally speaking, none of Italy's business. Into this charming arrangement, Pope Pius XII introduced the Institute for the Works of Religion in 1942. The timing, during the chaos of the Second World War, was convenient in ways that would only become clear decades later. Officially, the IOR existed to manage funds destined for religious works and charitable purposes. This is technically true in the same way that a door can technically be used as a table. The structure is there. The function has simply been repurposed. Here is the elegant problem, or the elegant solution, depending on where you are standing. The IOR was not a bank in any legally recognizable sense. It was a religious institution operating inside a sovereign state. This meant it owed no compliance to the Bank of Italy. It filed no reports with the Italian Treasury. No external regulator could compel disclosure of account holders, transaction records, or fund origins. Its clientele included cardinals, foreign diplomats, religious orders, and as investigators would eventually discover, people whose primary interest in banking was discretion rather than divine favor. Think of it as the world's most prestigious privacy screen, staffed by men in cassocks, surrounded by Renaissance art, and located approximately 15 minutes from the Italian Parliament. The physical proximity made the legal distance almost funny, if you were in a position to find it funny. Those who would eventually try to look inside were not generally in such a position. But the reasons why and the people who made sure of it come with considerably more drama. Paul Marcinkus stood 6'3", weighed well over 200 pounds, and had grown up in Cicero, Illinois, a Chicago suburb with a long and colorful history of not asking too many questions. He spoke bluntly, moved through rooms like someone who expected them to clear, and had served as a literal bodyguard for 2 popes before somehow becoming the most powerful banker in the Holy See. He had no formal training in finance. He had excellent instincts for loyalty, proximity to power, and the particular kind of confidence that fills a vacuum. Pope Paul VI appointed him to lead the IOR in 1971. The thinking presumably was that a tough American with good English and a firm handshake could modernize the institution and navigate the international financial world. The thinking was not wrong exactly. It simply failed to account for which parts of the international financial world Marcinkus would be navigating toward. The first introduction that mattered was Michele Sindona, a Sicilian lawyer turned financier who had built a banking empire across Italy, Switzerland, and the United States. Sindona was charming, meticulous, and connected, connected to the Vatican, to Italian politicians, to American business circles, and, as investigators would later document at considerable length, to the Sicilian Mafia. His banks were processing heroin profits moving out of Sicily and into legitimate-looking accounts. He needed respectable partners. Marcinkus provided the most respectable address in Western Christendom. In exchange, Sindona helped the Vatican Bank move funds internationally in ways that bypassed inconvenient regulatory attention. Both men appear to have found this arrangement natural. When Sindona's empire collapsed in 1974, taking Franklin National Bank in New York down with it in what was then the largest bank failure in American history, the connection to the IOR became difficult to ignore. Investigators noticed. Marcinkus stayed. Then came Roberto Calvi. If Sindona was the opening act, Calvi was the main event. Chairman of Banco Ambrosiano, Milan's largest private bank, Calvi had built such an intimate financial relationship with the Vatican that journalists had started calling him God's banker. The nickname was affectionate in the way that a lit fuse is affectionate. Marcinkus sat on the board of a Banco Ambrosiano subsidiary. The IOR held shares in Ambrosiano-linked companies across Luxembourg and the Bahamas. Hundreds of millions of dollars moved through structures that implicated both institutions, funds tied to mafia networks, political slush operations, and a shadowy Masonic lodge called Propaganda Do that had embedded itself in the Italian government. The triangle was elegant in its simplicity. Marcinkus supplied the shield, the sovereign immunity, the institutional credibility, the address that Italian prosecutors could not legally breach. Sindona and Calvi supplied the capital, the connections, and the gratitude of people who were very serious about their gratitude. Marcinkus, when asked about his financial acumen, once said, "You can't run the church on Hail Marys." He was not wrong. He was simply unclear on which church he was running and for whom. What happened when that arrangement finally cracked open is a story involving a missing body under a London bridge, and it deserves its own darkness. The mechanics were almost beautiful, if you could set aside what was being cleaned. Here is how you wash a billion liar. You start with a shell company, registered somewhere cooperative, Panama or Liechtenstein, where the ownership paperwork lives in a drawer that no Italian magistrate can legally open. The IOR controls this company, or appears to, or technically does not but functionally does. The distinction is intentional. The IOR holds accounts, issues instructions, and collects fees. The company exists on paper the way a ghost exists in a house, present enough to do the work, invisible enough to deny. Roberto Calvi's Banco Ambrosiano had built an entire constellation of these subsidiaries across Latin America. Ambrosiano overseas in Nassau, Manic SA in Luxembourg. A dozen others with forgettable names and unforgettable balance sheets. These entities borrowed money from Ambrosiano's parent, then lent it onward to other ghost companies that the IOR had quietly guaranteed. The money moved in loops, picking up legitimacy at each pass through a Vatican-adjacent account, the way a coat picks up the smell of a clean room. The instrument that made this work was almost comically simple. Marcinkus signed letters. Letters of patronage, they were called, in the elegant language of international finance. A letter of patronage stated, in careful phrasing, that the IOR was aware of a particular loan arrangement and considered it, shall we say, acceptable. It did not technically guarantee repayment. It did not technically commit the Vatican to anything. It simply implied, warmly, and with the full institutional weight of the Holy See, that the underlying companies were legitimate, connected, real. Bankers receiving these letters extended credit accordingly. The loans were not always real. The companies were not always real. The signature of Archbishop Paul Marcinkus was very, very real. Across the 1970s and 80s, an estimated $1.3 billion moved through these structures. That number comes from Italian parliamentary investigators who arrived at it only after years of forensic accounting through documents they were never fully authorized to see. Which is the final, most elegant piece of the mechanism? The IOR was not an Italian bank. It was not subject to the Bank of Italy's oversight. It was not subject to any regulatory body on earth because it existed within a sovereign state the size of a city block that had signed no banking treaties and welcomed no external auditors. When Italian investigators grew suspicious of Banco Ambrosiano, they could trace the money as far as the Vatican's walls and no further. The trail ended at a border you could walk across in 12 seconds. And behind that border sat a man who had grown up in Cicero, Illinois, and knew something about how neighborhoods handle inconvenient questions. Italian regulators knew something was wrong. They said so in writing as early as 1978. The Bank of Italy issued formal warnings about Ambrosiano's offshore exposure. The warnings went nowhere because the offshore exposure ran through an institution that did not acknowledge their jurisdiction to warn. The arrangement held together through an enormous act of collective pretending. Everyone could see the shape of what was happening. Nobody could prove it in a court that had authority to act. That changed in June of 1982 when Roberto Calvi did not come home. Franklin National Bank, the 20th largest bank in the United States, collapsed in October of 1974, and it remains the largest American bank failure of that era. Michele Sindona had been quietly looting it for years, moving funds between his Italian holdings and his American ones in a shell game that eventually ran out of shells. When regulators finally seized the institution, the hole in its balance sheet was roughly $2 billion. Sindona fled to Sicily, then New York, claiming everything was fine. Everything was spectacularly not fine. In Italy, a Milanese lawyer named Giorgio Ambrosoli had been appointed to liquidate Sindona's Italian bank holdings. This was, professionally speaking, a career-defining assignment. Personally speaking, it was a death sentence delivered on a slow schedule. Ambrosoli was meticulous, incorruptible, and deeply aware of what he had found. He wrote to his wife in 1975, 4 years before he died, that he knew the assignment would cost him his life. He continued anyway, cataloging fraud, tracing connections, building the kind of evidence that respectable people spend their careers pretending does not exist. He was shot outside his Milan apartment in July of 1979. 1 month after he had given sworn testimony about Sindona's network to American investigators. The timing, as always, was a coincidence. That same year, a journalist named Mino Pecorelli was managing to make everyone uncomfortable. Pecorelli ran a political gossip publication in Rome called Osservatore Politico, which is a very dignified name for what was essentially a blackmail newsletter written by someone with extraordinary sources inside Italian intelligence. He had published pieces touching on Vatican finances, on the connections between the Christian Democratic Party and organized crime, on names that powerful people would have preferred to keep out of print. In March of 1979, he was shot in his car in Rome. He had been preparing additional material on Vatican financial relationships. The material did not publish. Two men who knew too much, both in 1979, both very suddenly unavailable for further comment. Roberto Calvi watched all of this from his office at Banco Ambrosiano and, one imagines, slept rather poorly. By 1981, Italian authorities had accumulated enough evidence to convict him of illegally exporting currency abroad, a charge that was relative to the full scope of what had been happening, roughly equivalent to charging a wildfire with being overly warm. He received a 4-year suspended sentence and a fine of around 16 billion lire. He appealed, remained in his position at the bank, and continued operating. The Vatican continued its association with him, which tells you something useful about how these systems protect themselves. You convict a man of the smallest provable thing. You leave him in place. The larger structure remains intact because the larger structure has no edges that prosecutors can legally reach. The marble had cracked, but marble is thick. Investigators were circling, journalists were dying, a banker was convicted and promptly continued banking. The center appeared to be holding. It was not holding. And in the summer of 1982, the entire construction would come apart in a manner so theatrical that it almost seemed designed, even in its collapse, to obscure the truth. On the morning of June 18, 1982, a postal worker walking beneath Blackfriars Bridge in London noticed something hanging from the scaffolding in the grey light off the Thames. It was Roberto Calvi. His suit pockets had been stuffed with bricks and cash. A forged passport sat inside his jacket, bearing a false name. His feet dangled above the cold water, and the whole scene had the quality of a message written in a language that investigators would spend decades pretending they couldn't read. The first verdict was suicide. Because of course it was. Consider the logistics of that ruling for a moment. A 62-year-old man, terrified enough to flee Italy on a forged passport just days earlier, had allegedly climbed scaffolding beneath a bridge in the dark, filled his own pockets with bricks, and hanged himself in a location whose name, Blackfriars, directly echoed the Italian term for the Masonic lodge he secretly belonged to, the Frati Neri. The symbolism was so precise it was almost editorial. The coroner looked at all of this and wrote down suicide. A second inquest, in 1983, returned an open verdict. It would take until 2002 for Italian investigators to formally conclude what most people had suspected over breakfast on June 19th. Roberto Calvi was murdered. The Mafia communicates in symbols the way other institutions communicate in memos. A body beneath a bridge named for Blackfriars, weighted with the stone of judgment above water, suggesting a ritual punishment. The message was not subtle. It was not meant to be. While London was processing the scene beneath the bridge, something equally dramatic was unfolding back in Milan. Banco Ambrosiano, the largest private bank in Italy, was quietly ceasing to exist. Auditors found a hole in its accounts of approximately $1.3 billion, which remains an impressive amount of nothing to misplace even by modern standards. The money had flowed out through a labyrinth of shell companies in Panama and Luxembourg, many of them connected to the IOR, the Vatican Bank, which had provided letters of patronage essentially vouching for their existence. The bank collapsed. It was the largest bank failure in Italian history at the time. Thousands of ordinary depositors discovered that the institution they had trusted with their savings had been operating as a sophisticated mechanism for moving other people's money to places it could never be recovered from. The Vatican's response to all of this was genuinely a masterpiece of institutional language. The IOR issued statements carefully denying legal responsibility for Ambrosiano's debts while simultaneously agreeing to pay $244 million to creditors in what it described, with admirable precision, as a recognition of moral involvement rather than an admission of guilt. There is something almost philosophically interesting about that distinction. Not legally responsible, merely morally involved to the tune of $244 million. The Vatican essentially wrote a check large enough to retire comfortably on and insisted the check meant nothing about the check. Don't worry, it gets more elaborate. Because underneath all of this sat a structure that made the Vatican Bank connections look almost straightforward. Propaganda Due, known as P2, was a Masonic lodge operating in Italy under the direction of a man named Licio Gelli. It had somewhere approaching 1,000 members at its height, and those members included military generals, intelligence officers, cabinet ministers, journalists, and bankers. Calvi was a member. Sindona had ties to its orbit. The lodge had connections to Italian and foreign intelligence services and through channels that investigators kept finding and then finding themselves unable to fully trace to organized crime. P2 was not a club for networking over wine. It was, depending on which investigator you ask, either a deep state within the Italian state or a coordinated criminal enterprise wearing the costume of fraternal ritual. Possibly both. The Italian parliament dissolved it in 1981 after its membership list was discovered hidden in a suitcase at Gelli's villa. Nearly 1,000 names. No prosecutions followed that matched the scale of what the list implied. The cast of characters was now complete, the stage appropriately littered with bodies and missing billions. What remained was the question nobody in authority seemed particularly eager to answer. Where exactly had the money gone? Albino Luciani became Pope John Paul I on August 26, 1978, and by all accounts he seemed genuinely alarmed by what he found waiting for him in the Vatican's financial offices. Not in the dramatic thriller movie sense. More in the way a newly hired accountant flips open the books and goes very, very quiet. He had been Pope for barely a month when the alarm apparently deepened. Reports from those close to him suggest he had begun asking pointed questions about the IOR, about its connections to men like Michele Sindona, about the whole warm and comfortable arrangement between the church's bank and the various characters whose names we have spent several chapters accumulating. He had reportedly drawn up a list of officials he intended to remove. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a gentle man. Gentlemen who ask too many questions about money in the wrong rooms tend to find those rooms becoming unfriendly. On the morning of September 28, 1978, 33 days into his papacy, Pope John Paul I was found dead in his Vatican apartment. He was 65 years old. The Vatican announced a heart attack. There was no autopsy. The body was embalmed with notable speed, and the official statements about who discovered him shifted more than once. First a secretary, then a nun, then back again, as though the Vatican Communications Office was workshopping drafts. Here is where the story gets philosophically uncomfortable. Did Albino Luciani die of natural causes? Almost certainly, yes. He had a history of health problems, kept exhausting hours, and had been under enormous stress. A tired heart stopping at 65 is not mysterious. It is, in fact, deeply ordinary. But the Vatican, with its reflexive, almost compulsive instinct for secrecy, made the ordinary look extraordinary. No autopsy means no record. Hasty embalming means no toxicology. Conflicting statements about something as simple as who opened the door that morning means that even supporters of the official account are left patching together a story from tissue paper. The institution took a death that probably needed no explanation and wrapped it so thoroughly in opacity that the wrapping became the story. That is the peculiar horror here. Not necessarily that anyone did anything to John Paul I, but that the Vatican's handling of his death revealed, once more, exactly how its instincts operated when faced with scrutiny. Close the doors. Move quickly. Issue statements that do not quite agree with each other. Which tells you quite a lot about how it had been handling everything else. In 1987, Italian prosecutors did something that must have felt briefly like justice. They issued an arrest warrant for Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the broad-shouldered banker from Cicero, Illinois, who had run the IOR through its most colorful and catastrophic years. Two other Vatican Bank officials, Luigi Manini and Pellegrino de Strobel, received warrants alongside him. The charge was complicity in fraudulent bankruptcy, connected to the Ambrosiano collapse that had already cost creditors somewhere in the neighborhood of $1 billion and cost Roberto Calvi something considerably more personal. The Italian government delivered its request to the Vatican with, one imagines, a certain careful hopefulness. The Vatican said no. Not reluctantly, not apologetically. No. It invoked the Lateran Treaty of 1929, the agreement that established Vatican City as a sovereign state, and Italy's highest court backed them up. Vatican officials, the court concluded, were immune from Italian prosecution. The warrant dissolved. Marcinkus remained inside the Vatican walls for a time, technically unable to leave without risking arrest, but eventually that pressure eased too. The law had reached the border, tapped on the gate, and been politely turned away. This is the part of the story where the architecture of sovereignty reveals its more interesting functions. Nations establish immunity to protect diplomats from harassment, to allow the machinery of international relations to operate without someone arresting an ambassador over a parking dispute. It is a practical, reasonable idea. It is also, it turns out, an excellent place to store a banker with an arrest warrant. Marcinkus, for his part, had a philosophy. He expressed it with characteristic bluntness in a quote that has outlived most of his defenders. You can't run the church on Hail Marys. A sentiment that is, in fairness, not entirely wrong. Institutions require money. Money requires management. But there is a considerable distance between that reasonable observation and the specific management decisions that left a billion-dollar hole in the Italian financial system, and Marcinkus never seemed particularly interested in traveling that distance in public. He retired quietly. Not to some shadowed exile, not to a monastery with cold floors and serious silences, but to Sun City, Arizona, a retirement community built for comfort, where the weather is warm and the golf courses are well maintained. He played golf. He lived without apparent disturbance. He died in 2006 at the age of 84, having never stood before a courtroom, never entered a plea, never been formally required to account for anything under oath. What the 1987 warrant established in its failure was a precedent with a long shadow. Sovereignty, properly arranged, can function as a ceiling on accountability. It does not require malice to operate this way. It requires only institutions protecting their own boundaries, courts interpreting treaties correctly, and enough legal architecture between a man and a courtroom that the distance becomes effectively infinite. The money that passed through the IOR during those years moved through the hands of some genuinely dangerous people, which raises a question worth sitting with as we move forward. Who, exactly, were those people? And what did the Vatican's cooperation actually cost the world outside its walls? Michele Sindona drank his coffee on the morning of March 22nd, 1986, and within hours he was dead. Voghera prison, northern Italy, gray and cold in the way that Italian prisons managed to be gray and cold even in early spring. The official ruling was suicide. Sindona, the theory went, had somehow obtained cyanide and introduced it into his own espresso. 2 days after receiving a life sentence for ordering the murder of Giorgio Ambrosoli, the magistrate who had spent years methodically documenting exactly what Sindona had done, he had apparently decided to end things himself. If you find that explanation fully satisfying, this chapter may not be for you. The story had been building towards some kind of ending for years. In 1980, an American jury had convicted Sindona on 65 counts of fraud, perjury, and misappropriation connected to the collapse of Franklin National Bank, which failed in 1974 as the largest bank failure in American history to that point. He served time. He was then extradited to Italy, where the charges waiting for him were considerably more personal. Ambrosoli, the quietly courageous Milanese lawyer appointed to liquidate Sindona's Italian banking empire, had been shot 4 times outside his apartment in July 1979, the night before he was scheduled to give a deposition to American investigators. Sindona had been convicted of ordering that killing. The life sentence followed. And then the coffee. There is a particular pattern running through this entire story like a thread pulled tight. The people who knew the most, the ones who had seen the transactions, traced the flows, prepared to testify about the full architecture of the arrangement, had a troubling tendency to become unavailable. Ambrosoli, shot. Roberto Calvi, hanged under Blackfriars Bridge in London in June 1982, his pockets filled with bricks and cash. Sindona himself poisoned in a cell the state was theoretically responsible for securing. Each death arrived at a moment of maximum inconvenience for the people who would have been named in the testimony that never came. The pattern does not require a single coordinator. It requires only that enough people understand what is at stake, and that the stakes are high enough to make silence seem preferable to exposure. Sindona's death closed one door in a building full of closed doors. The money had moved, the men who moved it were dead or untouchable, and the institution at the center of it all remained standing, solvent, and sovereign. What remained were the questions and the very particular silence that surrounds them. Paul Marcinkus remained president of the Vatican Bank until 1989. Not 1983, when the Ambrosoli murder connections became undeniable. Not 1984, when the Vatican quietly paid $250 million to Banco Ambrosiano's creditors in a settlement that was not officially an admission of guilt. 1989. The man at the center of the scandal kept his desk, his title, and the sovereign immunity that made him legally untouchable by Italian authorities for the better part of a decade after the bodies had been found. That is not an oversight. That is a policy. John Paul II was, by most accounts, a genuinely moral figure. He was also a man who understood institutions and what it costs to let an institution admit what it has done. Marcinkus retired to Sun City, Arizona, where he lived quietly until his death in 2006. No charges. Lovely weather, apparently. The reforms, when they finally came, arrived in the way institutional reforms tend to arrive: urgently announced, slowly implemented, and measured against a standard the institution itself helped define. Pope Benedict XVI created the Vatican's Financial Intelligence Authority in 2010, the first internal oversight body in the bank's history. This was genuinely progress. It was also the same year Italian authorities seized 23 million euros directly from IOR accounts under money laundering suspicion. The oversight body and the seized funds arrived, more or less, simultaneously. Timing is everything. Imagine designing a fire safety office on the same afternoon your building catches fire. The Moneyval Committee, the Council of Europe's anti-money laundering evaluators, began assessing the Vatican in earnest through the 2010s. Their reports were diplomatically thorough in flagging the same inadequacies across multiple review cycles. Insufficient transaction monitoring. Beneficial ownership rules that left meaningful gaps. Compliance frameworks that existed on paper in ways they did not always exist in practice. The Vatican would respond, improve certain metrics, and arrive at the next evaluation with a fresh set of gaps that bore a family resemblance to the old ones. Pope Francis came in promising something that sounded genuinely different. He fired the IOR leadership in 2013, replaced the board, used the word transparency with the frequency of a man who meant it. Some things changed. Outside audits were commissioned. Accounts were reviewed. Several thousand dormant accounts were closed. And yet, the Vatican has continued to resist full integration with international anti-money laundering frameworks in ways that external evaluators have noted, politely, repeatedly, across years of reports. The structural condition that made the original scandal possible, sovereign immunity combined with financial opacity combined with no external enforcement mechanism, has been adjusted at the edges without being dismantled at the center. This is not unique to the Vatican. It is how institutions survive, by reforming just enough to exhaust the reformers. The story that began with handshakes in marble corridors and money moving through accounts no one was supposed to examine has not ended. It has become administrative. And somehow, that is almost harder to look at directly. Which brings us at last to the question of who, across all of this, ever actually faced consequences. In 2012, HSBC paid $1.9 billion to the United States Department of Justice for laundering hundreds of millions of dollars for the Sinaloa cartel. No executives went to prison. The bank was too large, too interconnected, too systemically important to risk a criminal conviction. The settlement memo even acknowledged that prosecuting the institution might destabilize global markets. Accountability, in other words, was weighed against inconvenience and found wanting. Sound familiar? Here is the blueprint. Wrap money in something the law hesitates to touch, whether it is the sovereignty of a holy institution, the complexity of a holding company nested inside a trust, nested inside a shell, registered in a jurisdiction that shares nothing with anyone, or the sheer size of a bank whose collapse would hurt more people than its crimes did. Then wait. The law will fold its hands. It always has. The Vatican Bank did not invent financial impunity. But it demonstrated, with extraordinary clarity, the exact combination of ingredients required to sustain it. Sovereign immunity provided the legal wall. Religious trust provided the cultural wall. Opacity provided the practical wall. Behind all three walls, transactions moved freely, billions disappeared into Ambrosiano's corpse, and the men responsible retired to pleasant climates. Now run that same logic through a Panama law firm in 2015. 11 million documents, 214,000 offshore entities, politicians, oligarchs, and wealth managers across 140 nations, all using the same basic architecture that Archbishop Marcinkus understood instinctively in 1972. The specific cassock may change. The structure does not. Or consider the crypto mixer, the 21st century's contribution to this tradition. A service that takes digital currency, tumbles it through thousands of anonymous transactions, and returns it cleaned of its history. No correspondent bank, no compliance officer, no sovereign to even petition. The Vatican at least had an address. Regulators pursuing crypto laundering operations have, on occasion, essentially been chasing fog with a net. The through line here is not corruption. Corruption is everywhere and always has been. The through line is immunity by design. The Vatican Bank was not a bug in the Catholic financial system. It was a feature of how institutions build themselves above scrutiny. Every mechanism that protected IOR from Italian prosecutors in 1982 has a descendant operating today under different branding. Diplomatic privilege became regulatory arbitrage. Religious trust became brand equity. Sovereign immunity became too big to fail. The costumes change. The function is identical. And here is the question that the whole story leaves sitting in the room, warm and uninvited. If the holiest institution on earth could launder billions across 2 decades, employ a bishop as its fixer, maintain ties to organized crime through the very men it canonized as Catholic financiers, and still produce not a single criminal conviction of any significance, what exactly is the mechanism by which a cryptocurrency exchange or a boutique wealth management firm housed in a glass building in Luxembourg is supposed to be held accountable? What fails there that did not already fail here? There is no comfortable answer. There is only the record. Close your eyes for a moment and stand in the IOR offices sometime around 1979. The stone is cool. The air smells of old wood and something vaguely ceremonial, the kind of institutional smell that communicates permanence and authority without saying a word. Men in dark suits move quietly past men in cassocks. Documents are signed. Accounts are credited. The silence is complete. Now open them. The smell is different now, no incense, just the faint metallic cold of a climate-controlled server room. The glow is blue, not candlelight. The robes are gone, replaced by the glow of monitors. But the silence is exactly the same. The particular silence of a place where oversight was invited but never quite arrived. Where accountability was discussed at length and implemented just enough to stop the conversation. That silence has a long history. The Vatican Bank did not start it. It just gave us the architectural drawings. Giorgio Ambrosoli was shot 4 times outside his Milan apartment on July 11, 1979, the night before he was scheduled to testify about Michele Sindona's financial crimes. He had told his wife months earlier that he expected to be killed. He went to work anyway. That is where we leave the ledger open. Roll the names slowly, because they deserve the weight. Ambrosoli, the lawyer who knew and died for knowing. Mino Pecorelli, the journalist who knew too much and was shot in Rome in March of that same year. Roberto Calvi, found hanging under Blackfriars Bridge in London in June of 1982, his pockets filled with bricks and cash. Michele Sindona, who died in a Voghera prison in March of 1986, 2 days after drinking a cyanide-laced coffee. Officially a suicide. Unofficially a very convenient one. And Pope John Paul I, whose 33-day papacy ended with him dead in his bed in September of 1978, no autopsy performed, no investigation opened, body embalmed with extraordinary speed. Whether he belongs on this list is technically unproven. History, however, keeps asking. Now the other list. Archbishop Paul Marcinkus, the man who ran the IOR through the worst of it, who was named in Italian arrest warrants, who sheltered behind Vatican walls and sovereign immunity until the statute of limitations expired, retired to Sun City, Arizona. He played golf. He died peacefully in 2006 at the age of 84. No Vatican official has ever served a prison sentence in connection with the Banco Ambrosiano collapse, the laundering arrangements with Sindona, or any related matter. The IOR paid $244 million in settlement to Ambrosiano's creditors in 1984, an expression of moral involvement rather than legal guilt. The Vatican was careful to specify moral involvement. One imagines the lawyers choosing that phrase very carefully over a very long lunch. The Institute for the Works of Religion, which is the IOR's full and rather beautiful name, is still open. It still operates under sovereign immunity. It still manages billions of euros in assets. It has undergone reform initiatives in 2010, 2013, and 2019, each announced with appropriate gravity, each followed by continued opacity. The walls are still cool stone. The silence is still the same. Someone once asked where God was in all of this. The Vatican, to its credit, never claimed God was in the accounting department. But the accounting department was run in his name, in his house, behind his walls. God apparently still has no comment.